Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Outliers YouTube channel and our program, Criminal Mischief, the Art and Science of Crime Fiction. I'm your host, DP Lyle. And today I have a great guest, Caitlin Rother, who is a true crime writer and has written a wonderful, wonderful book called Body Parts, and we're going to talk about that. Caitlin, welcome to the show.
It's Caitlin.
Caitlin, okay.
Yes.
I'm a cat guy, so Caitlin, okay, cool.
My nickname when I was in elementary school was Catwoman, so maybe that's easier.
Yeah, exactly. So welcome. Good to have you here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, tell us a little bit about you and how you got into the true crime writing world, which is a whole segment of the literary world that I knew Anne Rule very well before Annie passed, and
wow.
and so I've always been a true crime aficionado. But what got you into it? What got you interested, and how did you get there?
Well, I started writing stories when I was very young. I wrote them in college, but I was setting out to be a novelist, honestly. And I read a lot of Patricia Cornwell and Michael Connolly, and that's kind of what and a lot of thrillers too. So I read a lot of medical thrillers, which I really liked. So anyway, I was learning the craft as much as I could. I got into a writing workshop when I was a newspaper reporter, and I was like, I don't know how I'm going to have any time to do anything on the side because I was working in a small town with a small staff. But somehow I managed to get so inspired that I'm up at 2 a.m. scribbling in bed when I should have been sleeping because I'm, covering the city council and all kinds of other stuff, 4 stories a day sometimes, and writing as fast as I could type. So, but I was setting out to do that, and my first book that I wrote was a novel, a mystery novel. It took me 17 years to get published. But before I could get that published, I was a journalist and I was an investigative reporter. And I just said, well, I can't seem to get this novel published. So I guess I should stick to what I'm actually a professional journalist. Why don't I try writing true crime? So my first book was Poisoned Love, and it was to date my best-selling book by far. So I'm very grateful for that. I was lucky to have such a great start that my name got out there, quickly. And in San Diego, I think I went to a second printing in like 3 weeks of my first book. So that was really exciting. Haven't really had that since. But anyway, my love has always been crime fiction. So oddly enough, so I write narrative nonfiction. So it reads like a novel, but it's all true. And for anyone who tries to do it and to do it properly, it takes like 4 times the amount of research because you have to have an authoritative tone and you have to know what you're talking about and you can't make anything up. So unlike a novel where you're like, what should happen next? Let's see what exciting thing I can make happen. You can't do that. You know what the ending is. But the trick is to keep people reading. You still want to surprise people. So, you still want to give them the rewards. You still want to keep the pages turning. You still want to put in the suspense. So it's like fiction writing, storytelling techniques, but it's just all true.
Yeah. Thank you, Truman Capote, who probably launched the genre. Who knows?
Made a lot of stuff up, and that's not what I do.
No, he did absolutely. But
and I couldn't read his book. I'm sorry. I know it's
he called it faction. Yeah.
Yeah. I picked up the book. I got to page 2. I'm like, no, I made this up.
Well, that led you to your book that was just released yesterday. Ultimately, all of your writing came to this is what we want to talk about, and great cover. I love this. It's very spooky, and it reminds me almost of the Green River Killer. But yeah, but a lot of these guys used forested areas, and a lot of this took place up in Humboldt County. So why don't you tell us what this book's about, what this story is, and who the heck is Wayne Adam Ford?
Okay. So Wayne Adam Ford is a long haul trucker who he was a very complicated guy with a lot of psychological problems. Now, the thing is, when I write true crime, generally, I mean, this was my third book. When I first started, Poison Love had no gore, gruesome, graphic details. It was about a young, pretty toxicologist for the medical examiner's office who was also a meth addict, and it was a lot about
Kristen
forensics.
Rotham,
Kristen Rossum, right? It was a lot
famous
about
case.
forensics, right, and drugs, and so I mean, in terms of true crime, it was clean, to write about, and those are the kinds of stories I'm generally drawn to. But this one, I was drawn to. I was looking for another case. What can I do? Because I was still at the paper, and I was like looking for another story that didn't come across what I would normally write for the paper, because my paper, unlike places like the Washington Post, discouraged reporters from writing books. You couldn't, take time off or write them on the side like you can at other newspapers. They didn't like that. So I'm looking for something that's outside my, beat area. And the trial took place in San Bernardino County, which is some ways away from where I live in San Diego County. But he was a trucker, so it took place up and down California in a number of counties. The detectives found these bodies. He was a serial killer. He'd pick up prostitutes and troubled women in his truck. And these women thought they were going to have sex with him, and they did, but they didn't sign up for the kind of sex that he proceeded to have with them, which I don't want to go into too much detail because it's really awful. But he would torture them, he would choke them, cut off their oxygen with the carotid artery. And, he was like, oh, this is erotic asphyxia. Well, no, it isn't. Not when you're torturing them, and not when you're choking them until they pass out and bringing them back with CPR repeatedly. So, horrible, horrible, horrible. And then he said, well, these four women, I just couldn't bring them back. But he admitted during his interviews with detectives that he had had sex like this with at least 50 women. And these were the only four who didn't make it back, supposedly. And we know about the details and what he did to these women because he let one go. He picked up a prostitute. He did all this horrible stuff to her, and she testified in court during the trial. And the reason he said he let her go is because she listened to him and his woes about his ex-wife and his son that she wouldn't let him see, blah, 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 Mr. Victim, which really wasn't true. But this prostitute listened and he let her go. So that's how we know these horrible things. Plus, he confessed a lot of details to the detectives. And he was pretty messed up, though, psychologically. Like, he was getting a lot of details mixed up between the different women, and he couldn't remember which one was which. I mean, because if you've done this to at least 50 women, who could keep them straight,
What was his geographic range from?
Well, he lived in Arcata, which is up near Eureka in Humboldt County. Right. That was where he picked up his first victim. And so the reason for the update that this is a re-released book is because 25 years later, Humboldt County's cold case unit finally identified this first victim that he killed because he dismembered her. And so her family didn't know what happened to her. She'd been missing, and they just never knew they figured something must have happened to her, but they had no idea what. So he dismembered this first woman, and somebody a kayaker discovered her torso. So, and they found her left arm miles and miles away on a beach. So the currents took pieces of her and left them in different places. Those are the only two pieces they found. So her name is Carrie Ann Cummings. She now has her name back, and her family has closure. So to me, if you can have a happy ending for a serial killer book, this is as close to it as you're going to get.
So the update deals with her case, which was his apparently primary case. And how did they come about identifying her from these remains and end up giving her name?
So you mentioned the forests on the cover. Humboldt County is part of what's now known as the Emerald Triangle, where they grow a lot of pot. And before it was made legal in California as, recreational pot, cannabis, they call it now, which seems much more dignified, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
it was pretty bad up there. And so the sheriff got elected. And in 2018, he said, well, we've got at least 60 cold cases, unidentified remains, including this case, and a number of people who are just missing. And we don't know who these people are. And so they started picking some of the early cases, and this was one of the first ones they focused on because he turned himself in now. And that's the reason I chose to write about this story when I normally wouldn't write a serial killer story, but he's a serial killer who turned himself in. And the reason it made national news is because he had one of his victims' breasts in his pocket in a baggie, which is really, he said he did it because he wanted to make sure they believed him.
That would do it.
Like chicken. That's all I.
Yeah, exactly. That would do it. So, so they opened this cold case thing on Carrie, and then they decided. How did they then link her and identify her? There were some steps, I think, through genetic genealogy, which is obviously
Exactly.
a very hot field right now.
Right. That's the reason I was able to get my publisher to agree to re-release the book, because
Exactly.
I wrote 10,000 words about how this all came about. It's pretty fascinating. Honestly, I was just reading another book called Forever Witness by Ed Humes, who's he used to work for the Orange County Register. And I actually read one of his books as one of the first books before I started writing books myself. So that was pretty cool.
Hmm.
So yeah, basically her cousin, Jeff, was kind of dabbling in genetic genealogy with his sisters. And he said, he read about the Golden State Killer and how that case was solved using these consumer websites, kind of under the radar before it was really kosher to do that, because they didn't have anybody's permission. And they were kind of going through as if they were regular people, not as law enforcement. So after there was a controversy about that, because some people didn't like that and didn't feel like law enforcement should be using their DNA without their permission, a website called GED Match basically allows consumers to check a box or whatever and say, yes, I will allow my DNA to be used by law enforcement to solve crimes. So this guy had already had his DNA profile done by another website, but he submitted it to GED Match. And so when the cold case detectives decided to focus on this case, they got the DNA profile that they had gotten from the FBI from this case many years ago, which it kept in a freezer, from her tissues, basically, in the torso. And they submitted it to GED Match, and they found the cousin. And so they emailed him, called him, and said, do you have a missing family member? And he says, yes, I do. It's my cousin. And are there any closer family members, genetically? And he said, yes, there's her sister, Kathy. So they contacted Kathy, and they left a voicemail on her machine saying, I'm a detective, I'm calling from Eureka, the sheriff's department. Before she called him back, she started Googling. And so she, looked up, she found this case in the news stories, and she found my book, the original edition. And she said she read my book 3 times and she knew it was her sister. She could just tell by the very basic details that Ford had told the detectives. She was about 25. Her brain just didn't seem really very focused, kind of like mine. And, she had this can opener in her backpack. She had a little baggie that looked like heroin. And she really seemed like she hadn't been out there for very long, but she just, so it was her sister, and she could tell. So by the time she called the detective back, she said, I know why you're calling. So I felt pretty good that she was able to get closure and get the details of what happened from my book, because oftentimes, their victims' families are not always thrilled with my books, and I've been accused of, you're a predator preying on our tragedies and making money and this and that, which is not what I'm trying to do, obviously, but I'm trying to educate people and help people understand and protect themselves, obviously. But anyway, so it was a nice reaction to have. And she agreed to be interviewed a number of times. So I was able to pay a nice tribute to Carrie Ann Cummings and who she was before she became a victim, which I was not able to do in the first edition because I didn't know who she was.
Well, a lot of these guys, as you well know, they will confess to outlandish numbers, or they will minimize and have only a few numbers when you know that the number's a lot bigger.
Right.
Uh, how many did he actually confess to at the end of the day, and how many did they factually connect to him? Because there's a difference always.
Well, the thing about his MO is he dismembered the first one in his bathtub after it happened, and he kept parts of her and he put parts of her in this river. And he went with the detective to show him where he put this woman to see if they could try to find her head because they never found her head. So he actually tried to help them. But the thing about him is he only dismembered the first one. The second one and the third one he didn't. The last one he cut her breast off. He said only because it was getting in the way of how he was trying to get her into the aqueduct. So his MO and the reason that they contacted specific detectives to come and interview him is because he dumped bodies in bodies of water. So two of them were in the California aqueduct, and one of them was in a ditch. One of them was in this slough where the kayaker found her. So because they didn't find other women in water, those were the ones he confessed to because they knew where these bodies were from, and so I guess he probably would have said there were more if they had been found and they said, "Hey, is this yours?" So as far as we know, this is all there is, but it's possible that there could have been more.
Easily, yes.
Yeah.
And over what time frame was he active, as it were?
Just a year. And then he
Yeah.
said he knew it was wrong. And, I watched, there was a booking video. He was just a mess. He was crying. I mean, he had basically just is mentally kind of just disintegrated. When he was in the military, he was in the Marines. And this is something that I found really fascinating. When he was 19, he was a Marine and he was taking first aid classes, and he was out on a date with a woman who later became his wife. And he saw a car crash on the side of the road. And he said, "I want to stop and see if I can help." So he went over and he found this passenger was bleeding at the neck. And so he put his hand on the neck to stop the bleeding. Now, the ironic thing is, this is what he did when he raped these women later on. But initially, he did it to help save this man's life. And while he was doing that, a drunk driver hit him and knocked him 40 feet down an embankment, ripped off half his jaw, and he had a serious head injury, and he was in the ICU for 9 days. And after that, his brother told me that his personality dramatically changed. So there's a lot of research that's been done, and that there are
Yes.
killers on death row in many places. A lot of them have had head injuries. So
Particularly frontal lobe stuff. You know,
and also
yeah.
an alcoholic. He had a brain
hmm
scan done, and part of his brain had atrophied. So I mean, he was a kinky, bizarre guy with some strange ideas about how to have sex, and made his girlfriend and wives uncomfortable with things he forced them to do that they didn't really want to do. But after this head injury, it got much worse. He also he had a mental breakdown when he was in the Marines, and they had to sedate him with Haldol and restrain him. And so, I mean, he was pretty messed up, early
What
on.
was he like as a child? I mean, before he went into the Marines and before all this happened to him.
He was very sensitive, very emotional. I think there was also a genetic component. His mother was apparently bipolar, and she tried to kill herself several times. One of the times in front of his brother when he was only 9 years old, cut herself with a can, the top of a tuna can, when you open it and it's sharp on the edges, cut her wrist, and the kitchen was bleeding all over the place. She was also very promiscuous. So the father, who was apparently a very intimidating, threatening figure, he was in Army intelligence and he was gone a lot. She'd be sleeping around. And she also told Wayne, when he was, I don't know how old he was, but she told him that he was the product of rape, that his father had raped her. and he was the product of rape. And so, later on, he becomes a serial rapist. So, some of this is not his fault. Some of this is just happenstance. Some of it's genetic, some of it's environmental, and some of it, it just developed. This is how sexual predators are made,
Yep.
and that was partly why what I wanted to show in this book. But by the time he turned himself in, which I've not heard of another serial killer who turned himself in, that's the reason I wrote this book. And as I got into it, it got darker and darker and more difficult to be in this man's head. But that's the reason I wrote the book. So I see a lot of gray in this story. I've had readers who say, they don't feel any sympathy toward him. They don't, he's a terrible, horrible killer, and he did terrible things. But I personally don't believe that people who are mentally ill are evil. There's a lot going on in this guy's makeup. It's not so simple as that. So
He was also diagnosed, like depression and paranoid tendencies and antisocial. And I love the term borderline personality disorder because there's nothing borderline about some of these people that carry that diagnosis. They're full
well,
on up across the line. But he was diagnosed with a lot of different things. What ever shook out of that? What did they finally decide? What pigeonhole did they decide he fit in, or did he?
Well, my another personal thing that happened when I was writing this book is I married somebody, and I did not know this when I married him, but I married somebody with borderline personality. So I have some insight into the craziness that involves. Um, it's a very distorted way of thinking, first of all. So, and that is apparently forms in the first 5 years of your life. So that has to do with your parenting. And so when I write these books, no matter what they're about, I often say that the thing that I find similar in a lot of these true crime books, and I've only written two about serial killers. One of them was only killed two teenagers, but that's still considered a serial killer. It's the parenting,
Mm-hmm.
and it's
And the peers and all that. Yes, the people you interface with at a young age. Yes.
if you don't have good role models, and if
Mm-hmm.
I wrote about another serial killer whose mother told me that she read this book and said, I see a lot of my son in Wayne Adam Ford. In that case, that was John Gardner in Lost Girls that I wrote about. He raped and killed two teenage girls here in San Diego County. And that ended up resulting in Chelsea's Law in California, if you've heard of that. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
he had a mentally ill father as well. His mother had been molested when she was a child by a family member. She had been raped. He ended up having sex with his aunt. I mean, it was like a very dysfunctional family. And so, I had a psychiatrist tell me for that book, this guy really never had a chance almost because he had so much stuff stacked up. And I think Wayne Adam Ford had a lot of these things too that, like I said, were not his fault. When he was young, he was I think he had like another head injury when he was little too. Not maybe, not nearly as serious, but he was just always not, he seemed like he wasn't quite right. And he wanted to be punished. He knew he needed to be punished. And if he did something wrong, he would just get so scared of having to be punished, but he knew he had to be. And I think he had also issues with impulse control and
The frontal lobe stuff, and that's probably why he turned himself in. He needed to be punished. You know,
yes.
uh, yeah. You talk about that. It's that old argument about nature and nurture, and
Right.
and that's always an argument. And at the end of the day, it's really a combination of both. It always is.
Yes.
But I
Yes.
remember way back in the day, the old transactional analysis was that Eric Berne wrote about that you at age 3 you have kind of developed your personality and how you're going to be. I don't know how you really get to that because at 3-year-olds are maniacal and crazy anyway, So, but I've always said that you basically learn everything you need to know to navigate life during recess in the 3rd grade. because you're young, you're impressionable, you're around friends, and how you are going to interact with your peers and with other people is pretty much set by that time. And even though it changes, it nuances as you get older, but the basic structure of how you're going to navigate life is set at a fairly early age.
Well, now I may be getting my cases confused, but I remember, and I'm pretty sure it was this case, that there were some magazines left out. And in the old days, when they would have these women tied up,
Mm-hmm.
so he was like, I don't know, 8 or 9 or something, I think, when he saw these. And so when you're coming into your sexual
Yep.
puberty and you start relating sex and bondage together, and that's what gets you excited, that ends up, playing into your sexuality and what you like
Yeah.
later. And that's what he did to these women. He tied them up and, got off on that. He was a sexual sadist, but he was also a sexual masochist. So, he's a messed up guy.
Yeah.
These are called paraphilias. He liked to
Paraphilia.
stick needles into women's breasts. He did that to his wife, and she let him. And he had something called, so that's picarism. And then there's something called partialism, where you obsess about a body part. And again, it was the breast.
Mm.
So he would have his wife, he'd be having sex with her. He would cut holes in the sheet so her breasts would show through. I mean, these are weird things that I've never heard of until I wrote this book. But, they have names for them and they're categories and they're written down.
Sure.
So therefore, I guess other people have them too.
And a lot of the things that you've talked about with him is, it kind of also reminds me a little bit of Dennis Rader, BTK, where he was both a sadist and a masochist. He used to dress up and tie himself up and
Mm.
things like that, and some autoerotic asphyxia stuff. So I mean, that's kind of a masochistic end, and then he was on the sadistic side because he would do this. He would put plastic bags and stuff over their head till they passed out, and then revive them. And he would do that
Oh,
over and
really?
over
Well, I
again.
wonder if you, I wonder if you read about him, got his
Yeah.
some
Who
ideas.
knows? Obviously. Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of
Not
overlap with these guys.
not my kind of fun. Not anything
So
I
I
want.
recommend I recommend everybody to buy the book and read it. It's not for the faint of heart, but it's
Right.
very good. And I'm glad you updated it because I think that adds to it. And I see that Greg Olson, a good guy, said you were the next day on Rule, and that's high praise because Annie was fantastic. What's next for you? Where are you heading now? Are you working on another story, another case, a novel, a non?
Yes, all the above. I have a case. I have another book that's coming out in June. I don't want to say too much about it, so we can just tease it. But it's To the Bone, and it's about the McStay family murders. This was a case that took place in San Diego County and San Bernardino County, but mostly all over Southern California because it touches like different characters who are involved in this thing live all over the place. So it was covered heavily by all the Southern California media. And it was also featured on the cover of People magazine. So it was a pretty high profile case nationally as well. So it's a family of four. Joseph and Summer were the parents, and Gianni and Joey Jr. were 3 and 4 years old. And I kind of broke one of my rules, and that is that I don't like writing true crime murder stories about children because I can't take that. So
Right.
there's no details about any kind of torture or gruesome things because honestly we don't know them, and that's part of what the whole mystery of this case is about. Is even after a man was convicted and sent to death row, we still don't know exactly what happened, how they were killed, who really killed them for sure, because the defense's whole case was that they got the wrong guy, and there were two business associates, and that the sheriff's department in San Bernardino focused on one and not on the other when the other one had the exact same motive. And so anyway,
Interesting.
they were in Fallbrook, California, and it's like mysteriously just disappeared one day. The day before, Joseph had lunch with this business associate who was eventually convicted, named Chase Merritt, and so he was apparently the last one to see them. And then basically, nobody heard from them again. There was no activity on their credit cards, no activity on their cell phones. Nobody could reach them. And initially, his mother and his brother and his dad were not that concerned because he kind of sometimes would take the family on a vacation or turn off the phone and go off the grid for a little bit, but not when he had such big projects pending, some big exciting waterfall. He manufactured waterfalls with this guy Chase Merritt. So they didn't really know where he was. And the brother came over with Merritt, and they went inside the house, and they found like there was just like breakfast left out, like eggs out on the counter, some popcorn for the kids. They got partially eaten apple and coffee in the pot. And they left their dogs outside with no food and no water. They normally slept inside. Summer's prescription glasses were there, her favorite boots, and they just like it just seemed weird. Like where did they go all of a sudden? And I remember when this story first broke, and I thought, well, that's weird, because I remember there was another family I think that was found in a car, and they had been shot, and it was like a similar kind of mystery, like who were they involved with? Who would kill them? Well, so anyway, nobody knew where they went. So the San Diego Sheriff's Department pursued the case as a missing persons case. And the detective argued, well, the judge said he saw nothing that was criminal about this, because initially the first search warrant affidavit said, I think these guys were murdered. But then after that, the detective claimed that he never saw any evidence that they were murdered. So all he could do is pursue a missing persons case. And he's been harshly criticized for that since. But he basically pursued it and then dropped the case a few years later and said, well, I think they went to Mexico, because there was some kind of grainy video found at the pedestrian crossing into Mexico that showed these two adults with two children, and they decided it was them because their car was found in a parking lot in San Ysidro nearby. So, okay. So anyway, 3 years go by. The guy drops the detective drops the case, says, I'm going to hand it over to the FBI, which never actually really happened. 8 months later, two shallow graves are found with these skeletal remains of this family. So it's clearly they did not go to Mexico. They were murdered and dumped in the desert. And each of the family members had a pretty large hole in their skull, mostly in the back. So it seems like somebody hit them with something to kill them. And this is where it gets, I start pointing things out, lots of flaws in the investigations and flaws in the reasoning. If the prosecution and the sheriff's department claimed that they were killed in that house and that Chase Merritt killed them there, and there was an argument over money, blah, blah, blah. There's no blood in the house, not a single drop anywhere. And if you know anything about head injuries, when you smack somebody with a big hole in their head, those things bleed a lot, and there's a lot of splatter, and you can't hide that, and you can't clean it, because even if you paint over it, they can still see it with the whatever you call it, blue star.
Luminol and Blue Star, yeah.
So anyway, they did search warrants. They went back later because it was years later, a different person was living in the house. They could never find any blood or any DNA to link them to the house. They did say, well, we found some of Chase Merritt's DNA in the trooper that was found by the border. But, my problem with that is that it was like one of those trace amounts, and it was teeny, and the person who last drove the car should have had, more DNA, and that was Joseph. And the car seat was not in the right position for somebody as tall as Chase Merritt. I mean, there were just so many things that were wrong. Right. So, I point a lot of those things out in the book, and there are holes in the case, many unanswered questions. And I don't take a position on, guilt or innocence of Chase Merritt, but I just think there were a lot of problems with this case. So.
And what's the title of this book?
It's called Down to the Bone.
And it'll be out in June.
Yes, June 24th. Okay. You can pre-order it now.
Where can people reach you if they want to know more about you and all your books and things like that? Where would they go?
You can go to Amazon, you can go to any bookstore, and if they don't have it, because a lot of places don't have true crime sections, or if they do, they're small. And some of my books are out of print, so they're still available in audio and ebooks, but they're, you can find them pretty much anywhere. And if you want a copy of an out of print book, you can contact me. I have a limited inventory of my books that are out of print. I
What's
also
your
like to
website?
say have embarked on a series of thrillers with Thomas and
Ah,
Mercer. Okay, so I finally am getting back to my original passion, and what I learned was I I really, really wanted to write these mysteries and thrillers, and I just didn't know the material well enough. So now
right.
that I've written all these true crime books, I know how detectives think. I know what they do in their investigations. I know what order they do their investigations, and I know what's right and what's wrong about, proper procedure. And if I don't know, I have a lot of people that I can call and interview, and
Sure.
I'm having so much fun writing this
Yep.
series of thrillers, and I'm writing them really fast, and
Yeah.
I'm really loving making some of this stuff up, but a lot of it's based on stuff that I've
Sure.
written about, or I'm inspired by things that I've written about. And
But the beauty is with fiction, you can get messy. You can spin a yarn, and that's what's great.
I've made up a sex drug,
Good. Yeah.
sort of has a little sci-fi in it too, but basically
Okay.
it's a drug that doesn't exist.
You
And
have you have books in your thrillers in the pipeline now that are going to be
yes,
coming out.
I've got two I have under contract, and I've written two more. I'm kind of still working on the second two. I
When
haven't
when
got
when
to
when
yet.
is that train going to begin?
Hopefully in January.
Of next year?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'd like to have you back, and maybe we'll get you on our other show, our Get to Know, which is more about not true crime, but more about fictional crime. And so we'll
Okay.
do a get to know interview with you and get you up on the Outliers YouTube channel and go from there.
That'd be
This will
great.
be under the Criminal Mischief banner because we got two different shows that we do. And yeah, good. Well, I tell you, this has been great.
Thank you. I have one more thing I want to say. I do
Yeah.
have one novel out, and it is the prequel to my series, and it's called
Okay.
Naked Addiction. So if you want to get started now, that is still
Okay.
in print.
Cool. Well, this has been fantastic.
Thank you so
You know,
much. What a great.
fascinating talking with you, and I'm
Me too.
fascinated with the book. Everybody go out there and buy it. Go to Caitlin's website and look everything up, and look at her other books, and get ready for a new voice in fiction that's coming from Thomas and Mercer.
There,
So, uh,
can I mention my book signings, because they're this
oh,
weekend and the next few weeks?
yeah, I see you got one coming up at Book Carnival, but unfortunately, I'll be up in Denver at Left Coast Crime. I love Anne and I love Book Carnival. So,
It's great. Yeah.
yeah.
My first two book signings are this weekend, Saturday and
Okay.
Sunday. I've got one in Coronado at Bay Books from 12 to 2 on Saturday, one at Barnes and Noble in Carmel Mountain, which is also in San Diego County, from 1
Yep.
to 3. And I've got on March 8th, Saturday, from 1 to 3 in Riverside, which is closer to where this all happened and was tried, at the Galleria Barnes and Noble.
Mhm.
And then on the 15th, March 15th, on a Saturday, from 2 to 4 at Book Carnival, which is in Orange
Yep.
County.
Yeah. All right. I will. I'll let you know when this goes up, and we can both spread the word.
Okay, great. I
Okay.
wasn't sure if it was live, so.
No, it's not live. You got off the hook.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank
Thank
you
you so
so
much.
much. And
It's
I
great.
want to thank everyone for joining us here at the Outliers Writing University YouTube channel and our program, Criminal Mischief, the Art and Science of Crime Fiction. And as you know, we'll be back with more interviews and more stories and more shows about everything, both fictional and real, in the crime world. So until then, take care.